episode of Vital Times, the podcast. I am your host, Rita Agarwal. Today, I am really excited to talk to Diana Lautenberger. Diana is the Director of Gender Equity Initiatives for the Association of American Medical Colleges, which is a nonprofit organization of all 155 accredited medical schools in the U.S. and 16 accredited schools in Canada. Ms. Lautenberger is an intersectional feminist, scholar, and educator. She approaches her work through a deep connection with equity and the goal of radically changing society's patterns of injustice by challenging the status quo. She holds a master's in art education and has been at the AAMC for 14 years. In July 22, Ms. Lautenberger was the first author of a manuscript on sexual harassment in academic medicine. Medicine, like so many other industries, struggles with harassment issues despite many recent anti-harassment efforts. While harassment in and of itself is problematic, it is often just part of a culture of harmful workplace behavior, which can then contribute to lack of engagement, dissatisfaction, and intent to leave. The, the highest levels of harassment, this was very surprising to me in her study, were reported in the departments of anesthesiology and emergency medicine. This is particularly timely in light of two very recent articles that just came out looking at burnout in medicine. The first article was published in Anesthesiology and was by Afonso et al. That showed that of the anesthesiology attendings who completed the survey, almost 70% were at high risk for burnout symptoms, and 19% met criteria for having burnout. The survey was of ASA members, and it had approximately an 11% response rate. The other article was just published in JAMA Network Open Access in December 15th, 2023, and looked at well-being parameters and intention to leave the current institution amongst academic physicians. This article, again, surprising to me, found that anesthesiologists had a much, much higher intention to leave than any other subspecialty in medicine. In both articles, the incidence of burnout was higher in women and the intention to leave was higher in women, and job dissatisfaction and satisfaction with professional development were lower in women. Sexual harassment is clearly not the only factor contributing to these issues, but any institution that doesn't address or take the harassment seriously is likely to have a higher incidence of faculty dissatisfaction and lack of professional fulfillment, and a higher incidence of faculty who are looking to leave that institution. With that, I'm delighted to introduce Diana. And my first question to Diana is really just to tell us a little bit about herself.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rita. It is so fantastic to be here. Thank you for that amazing introduction and context setting for our conversation today. And I hope you don't mind, I always use first names. That's
No.
just how I roll. So, yeah, really excited to be here today and to talk a little bit more about our work and just have a conversation really around sexual harassment and how it's really playing out in academic medicine. And so, to start all the way back at the beginning, my path to the AAMC is kind of a funny one. I'm not a physician. I'm not a scientist. I'm somewhat of an interloper. Thank you for bringing me into your community. But my background is really in art education and gender studies. And so a lot of my grad work was working with DC public school kids, K through 12, using art objects to talk about really difficult subjects. So to talk about racism, sexism, classism, and really thought that I would be doing that for my whole life. But I started a job at AAMC and just fell in love with the people. Medicine and healthcare was never a field that I thought that I would go into. I barely went to the doctor before I started going to AAMC. Now I'm prioritizing my health, which is really great. but it has really just turned into this love story that I have for academic medicine in particular, and just really working really closely with this fantastic community of practitioners, of faculty, of learners, to really understand these passionate folks who really want to improve the health of all. And so my journey to the AAMC is really interesting in that folks who specialize in gender and women's studies, they could go work for a lot of different organizations. Probably AAMC is not one of the first ones that come to mind, but what I love about my job is that I love working in this applied
By the
way
way.
with an audience that may never have thought about diversity, equity, and inclusion before. And so in that way, I get to work with really interesting people and help give them a different perspective about how they can be doing their work. And so it does require a little bit of a push pull approach. There's this phrase that's been going around that I really, really love, and it kind of resonates with me in terms of how I approach my work. Is that we apply gentle pressure relentlessly, and so that's with leaders. Of we got to just keep pushing gently a little bit more, and I have seen those changes over my 14 years at AAMC.
I love that term, gentle pressure relentlessly.
Yeah,
I
isn't that
feel like
great?
that is to some degree the way I also practice a lot of times in trying to change behavior
Yeah.
with people. Gentle pressure. I try to be gentle. Occasionally it gets rough, but no.
Yeah, sometimes you really got to push, but most of the time I feel like people are more willing to come along with you if it's gentle.
So what made you or the AAMC, I'm not sure who was the impetus behind doing the survey regarding sexual harassment in medical schools?
Yeah, there were a lot of folks that were involved. Obviously, the Gender Equity Office was the big pusher. Going back to our push pull analogy, but really starting outside, it was really the National Academy's NASM, their report that came out in 2018, that was really the catalyst for us to even have that conversation internally about what do we need to be doing? What do these rates look like? How do we understand more about this topic? It really was that seminal publication. And if folks have not read the NASM report on sexual harassment, it's now become the preeminent report that everyone cites. There's just so much rich information in there. And so when that report came out, it was pretty shocking to us in the medical community and in academic medicine to find that medicine was only second to the military in terms of really high incidences and prevalence rates of sexual harassment. And that was really disturbing to us, especially when we think about some of our most vulnerable populations, our students. The rates among medical students was 50% to 80%, and these were some really shocking numbers. And so then when we started to look into it more and really digest what the data that was in the report, we started to realize that we do not have good data on national rates. There are lots of local or institutional or regional reports that look at rates, but we don't have a good sense of nationally across medical schools and health systems what this looks like. And so we kind of looked around and turned to each other and said, I think we're the organization that needs to be doing this.
Yeah.
But one really important approach, though, of how we decided to do the survey is that sometimes in gender equity, we tend to approach a lot of these topics in silos. And so, it's salary equity we're going to address over here, sexual harassment we're going to address over here. It was really important that we didn't do that. We know that we have to take a multifaceted, multi pronged approach to equity and inclusion, and so really thinking about how sexual harassment can contribute to a lot of these other equity inclusion issues that are going on. And so that's really why we decided to embed sexual harassment questions within the AAMC's engagement survey. It's called the Standpoint Survey. That's an optional survey for medical schools to take, and that was a really strategic decision. Is we could put out our own survey, just a standalone one. Do we think we're going to get a great response rate? Maybe not so much. So that was actually an intentional decision to put it into the Standpoint survey. So then we could actually crosswalk and map sexual harassment rates to global engagement, to satisfaction, to intent to leave, to some of these retention issues that you brought up at the beginning. And so that's been turned out to be a good decision on our part because it's really given us some really great data.
Can we just take one step backwards? You referenced the NASM paper quite a bit, and so for viewers that are interested in looking it up, NASM is the National Academy for Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Is that
Medicine.
right?
Yep, you got
And
it.
I remember seeing that article in 2018, and that basically found that there was really high rates of sexual
Yeah.
harassment across many, many industries, but medicine, you said, was second to the military for
Yeah.
having this as be problematic behavior.
Right.
And before, before, and I think, a lot of people, and I've heard this both from male colleagues as well as female colleagues, as well as gender diverse colleagues, well, if it's not happening to me, why do I care? Why,
Mhm.
what, I mean, other than the points that I made at the beginning, why should people care about this?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and I think not having sufficient conversation around this is why we haven't made as much progress because it's been secret and stigmatized and it's kind of something over there and we just read about in the New York Times a year later or when a faculty member ends up leaving the institution we don't talk about it. And so I think there are a number of things that we need to consider in why people should care. There's really there are moral reasons to care and then there are also actually business reasons to care, which sometimes it's frustrating for us to have to make a financial or business case for diversity, equity, inclusion. But sometimes we have to. Sometimes, if that's what's going to get more people on board, that's great. And so, thinking about, kind of the moral reasons to care first, um, harassment impacts everyone. Even if you're not the target, even if you think that it doesn't, it does. And we really found that in our data and with some of the folks that we interviewed, some of the institutions that we interviewed. And so in the report, we introduced this concept known as ambient harassment. And so that's when harmful or negative behaviors are going on around you. Maybe you're not the target, but you are either witnessing, experiencing, even if it's, through word of mouth or you just heard this experience. That has a profound impact on us because it is this idea, and there's a lot of people talking about moral injury right now.
Mhm.
When there is behavior, when things are being said around us, even if we're not the target, but if it violates our values, that's going to impact us, especially for clinicians and people that are deeply connected to health and well being. And so there is this moral imperative for folks to realize the impact that ambient harassment, in the same way that ambient racism, ambient sexism, these experiences and this idea that if it's not directed at me, it's not my place and it has nothing to do with me. Well, if we're really trying to create inclusive environments where people feel like they belong, we understand that connection, that my wellness is bound up in other people's wellness. And so that is that moral imperative to want to care because it's having an impact on you whether or not you think it is. And then there are really strong business cases that we outline in the report about how, and we outlined this in the report, hopefully pretty clearly, that really harassment costs us money and lots of it. And in these current times that we know institutions, we are all cash strapped. We're looking for extra ways that finances are really tight right now. I think we hear that across the board at all medical schools. And so we know that harassment costs us lots of money, both to the institution, if you're talking about litigation, if you're talking about turnover costs, but it also impacts us individually in terms of our productivity costs and losses. And so this is really especially why leaders should care about harassment is that it's costing your institution money. It may not come out on the budget sheet because it's not as easy to identify, but it's costing institutions millions of dollars, if not just in legal fees, in the costs of individual productivity. I can't show up and do my best work and produce as much if I'm undergoing all these experiences, and really just for the institution itself.
And is that partly also because of if people end up leaving, then
Yeah,
cost of recruiting a new I've read numbers from, depending on the specialty of the physician, but it can cost sometimes, hundreds of thousands to
yeah,
recruit a new physician in to a position, that
exactly.
another person is fulfilling. So
Up to
it's
even 1 million in some studies. And so if you think
exactly,
about, you have a productive faculty member at your institution that you've been investing in, you lose that faculty member because nothing was done about their harassment experiences and all of the money that you've just lost of having to now recruit another faculty member in and invest that same money all over again. It's really wasteful.
Yeah. I did want to dive in a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of the survey that you did.
Yeah.
I know that there were a certain number of questions, and I've read the study several times, but there were certain, but it's better obviously to hear it from you. But there were questions that were asked of the people who completed the survey, and some of them honestly struck me as a little like, how is this really harassment? Just because I hear a dirty joke that I'm not easily offended. I went to medical school in the '80s in Texas. There, I have an honest
I'm
basic
sure you've heard it all.
it bounced off of me. Sometimes I was guilty of telling some of these jokes, which I now cringe at a little bit. But I know there were more than just those questions. But I've heard people poo-poo some of it and say, "Well, how does hearing a dirty joke? How does that really affect me?" So, if you wouldn't mind spending a few minutes just talking about what the questions were and then maybe also how you settled on or chose those questions. I know it said that they were validated, but this is not my area of expertise. So
Yeah,
I'm really curious to know how
sure.
to
So
do
folks
that.
know that there are, it's a great question. And it really goes back to fundamentally some of the decisions that we made about how we wanted to approach the survey. And so one of the big pieces of the NASM report was that it really helped people understand that there are multiple different kinds of sexual harassment. And they outline that pretty clearly in their iceberg graphic. And we all tend to think about the really awful, egregious stuff, the touching, the quid pro quo, if you don't give me a date, or unwanted physical contact or attention. That's typically what comes to mind when we think about sexual harassment. A big finding of that report was that the most common form of harassment, but the least talked about and researched, is gender harassment. And so those were really the types of experiences that we wanted to focus on. And so the 5 behaviors that we included in the survey come from a pretty standard questionnaire known as the SEQ, the Sexual Experiences Questionnaire. And so we wanted to, even the questions aren't perfect. Those are decisions that you have to make when you're doing research sometimes, but we wanted to make sure that they lined up with other established instruments that folks use for sexual harassment that are already out there. We didn't want to make completely new questions. And so in that, we're really focusing particularly on gender harassment experiences. And so that really is that invalidation feeling based purely on one's gender. And so we can think about kind of the other 2 behaviors of sexual harassment as kind of come ons, and gender harassment is really the put downs. And so that's kind of maybe a better way to think about it. And so those dirty jokes, again, we become so numb to it and so used to it when we're not actually realizing a lot of our language is really violent and is really sexualized. And I don't think when we talk about wellness, when we talk about burnout, these are not things that we think about how hearing these kinds of things all day long, what kind of impact we can actually have, in our individual selves. And so we went with those questions because we really wanted to dig more into gender harassment, since that's what the report found, that it's really the most common form, but we don't really collect a lot of data about it. Again, we only think about that really egregious more behavior. And so the kinds of questions that we ask, the reason in instruments like the SEQ, the reason that you list out specific behaviors is that we really have to ask about those behaviors, because typically, and a lot of folks have talked about this, if you ask someone, have you been sexually harassed? You'll probably say no. If you ask someone, but have you been around someone telling a dirty joke, or has somebody referred to people of your gender in a condescending way? Oh, absolutely. And so that's why we really have to ask about the behaviors, not have you been sexually harassed. And so again, we wanted to be able to make that connection, though, about not just what those experiences are. That was, obviously the primary reason we did the survey, was to know what the rates are, but we wanted to be able to map that to something greater. And so that's why we also asked the second collection of questions, which are really more about safety and comfort and knowledge of reporting and resolution. And so are those three additional questions about asking people's confidence level of, that the institution's going to do something if you report, you know who to report to, and you think that there's actually going to be a resolution to that. And so we continue to administer the questions. We haven't changed them since we started collecting them, because we want to make sure that they're valid over time. But one area that I do think we need to expand on or think more about is this idea of online harassment now that we're
Mhm.
in
Yeah.
hybrid environments. I mean, we came up with the questions, in 2018 and 19 is when we first started doing the survey. That was a completely different world and a completely different time. And so that's something that we're starting to think about, is how we may need to include additional questions around more the online harassment.
The other thing that I noticed was missing in the questions, I think, and for us, particularly as anesthesiologists who work very closely and intimately with surgeons, nurses, scrub techs.
Hmm.
Sometimes, depending on our practices, we may be working with CRNAs or anesthesiology assistants. We're working with other anesthesiology colleagues, with other proceduralists, the whole variety of different people. And I suspect this is partly why emergency departments and us are the highest, reported the highest rates of this, is because we
Yeah.
probably, most subspecialties, work with such a variety of different kinds of people. One of the things that we didn't see in that I don't remember reading, was who was doing the harassment. Because I
Right.
don't think the questions asked that. They asked, have you experienced this? Have you been in a situation where this has happened? Have you had people, the questions about referring to your gender in a condescending manner, or
Hmm.
telling, I forget, I'm sure you know all the details of the questions, and I should know them because I keep reading the article, but I forget. But those kinds of questions
Yeah.
of, have you felt like you can't get what you need, can't get fulfilled because of your gender? But it's not asking really who. And I think in a lot of other fields, a lot of other, jobs, it's often, you sort of assume that the harassment is coming from people either who are your peers or people who
Hmm.
are above you in the hierarchy. And I
Hmm.
think in both emergency medicine and anesthesiology, there's this whole huge glob of people that you
Oh, sure.
interact with that may be
Yeah.
doing some of this harassment, as well as the online stuff. I think that's a really great point.
Yeah, and you're raising a great point, in much more comprehensive, I should say, if the survey is just looking at sexual harassment, usually those kinds of questions are included, is who was the source, and a lot of other questions. And we had to make some decisions about, the standpoint survey is already very long. It's over 100 items, and it's everything about how satisfied you are with your medical school to governance and, all of this other kind of stuff. So we wanted to be strategic about how many questions we were going to put in there that would give us good data. But the one thing that we did make sure to put in there is that we did ask, these are for non-patient related experiences, which we
Okay.
also know that patients can often be and are sometimes the most frequent source of sexual harassment is coming from patients. And so the way that we labeled the question was coming from a peer, a colleague, staff member, not related to patients. But this is definitely an area that I think we want to go and explore more in the future, because really, and you're absolutely right. And I think that that's part of the reason that the rates are so high in anesthesiology and emergency medicine. It is exactly what you described, the number of people that you're coming in contact with, and then some of the interdisciplinary power dynamics at play, I think, are often at play when we're talking about sexual harassment rates. And so that's definitely somewhere that we want to go in the future, because when you do look at other studies, it really is all over the map. You tend to think that it has to be the attending or it has to be the surgeon in the room. Sometimes it's the learner, sometimes
Oh,
it's the
interesting.
scrub tech, or,
Wow.
like, it really, there are trends, I think, But I think the point is that the sources they can be nurses, it can be multiple sources from where this behavior is coming from. And that's kind of the next phase, I think, of where we want to get to. And then the patient experience is a whole other bucket,
Yeah.
that we could go down.
With how often is the Standpoint survey sent out? Is that annually or every 2 years, every 5 years?
So the schools, they have cohorts every year of schools that do it.
Okay.
Schools that elect to do it, they do it every 3 years or so is typically how they do it. And so, you have in any given cohort, 25 schools or something that are surveying that year. And they're very representative from all over the country, big schools, small schools, public, private. They look at all of those factors to make sure that it's pretty representative.
And so some medical schools choose not to take part in the Standpoint survey at all?
Correct. So you have to pay for it. And
Oh,
so that's part of it. It is one of the most popular resources that the AAMC has. A lot of people, they go out to consulting firms and Gallup to do their satisfaction surveys, but Standpoint, I'm not on the Standpoint team. I feel like I'm, doing a little bit of a commercial for them, but it really is the only satisfaction and engagement survey specifically validated for academic medicine faculty and staff. And so the questions very much reflect the environment of academic medicine, where some of those more general surveys, workplace surveys, they don't really apply.
you don't. Okay. What did you find the most surprising about the results of the survey?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Sadly, not much surprises me anymore, when you do this work and you're familiar with the
Yeah.
literature. So sadly, not a lot surprises you, but there were a number of things that we found really interesting. Just first off with the response, the rate that we got of 33% of women experience harassment. We both simultaneously were surprised that we got that high of a number, and we also simultaneously thought that it seemed low. And so we think it probably evened itself out, where we still have some culture and climate issues in academic medicine and cultural barriers to people feeling like they can actually report. And so I do think there's some underreporting still, but we're on the right track. If we had gotten, something less than 10%, we would have said we're wildly off here. We were expecting it to maybe be a little bit higher, but it is falling somewhere in some of those national averages. Some of the other interesting things that we pulled out or really spent a lot of time thinking about, we were surprised that the rates for women of color were similar to white women. They were a little higher for women who report multiple races, but overall they were pretty similar for other racial and ethnic categories. That's a whole nother topic that I think we could get
Right.
into,
Oh,
of
absolutely.
just
Yeah.
how different folks have had to build resilience to particular kinds of behaviors. But that was a little bit different, I think, from some of the literature that we had out there. We were also surprised that there were such high rates or such a difference between women and also men, actually, between anyone of any gender who has an administrative title, where there were higher rates among those who are maybe in the dean's office, maybe they're a section chief, some kind of administrative title. And so I think that that's a really interesting piece that we still need to look at when we think about where sexual harassment is happening. I think we have an idea again in our mind of, it's someone inappropriately touching someone in a lab, or asking someone out. But it's also in the boardrooms. It's in, these meeting conference spaces. It's also in the spaces where we have the most power in our institutions. And so there's a lot more that we could unpack there of thinking about, and it was both men and women had higher rates of sexual harassment who had administrative titles. And then, we were really interested at the high number of men, and that was intentional. We really wanted to bring that out. Again, this is not just something that happens to women. This happens to folks of all genders, and we need to care about everyone's experiences and these behaviors and addressing them. So those were some of the kind of interesting facts or data that we pulled out that we're going to continue to monitor as we continue to publish the updated results.
I will say, other than being really surprised that anesthesiologist was the top reporting department, I sort of expected emergency medicine to be
Hmm.
number one. I was shocked that it was anesthesiology. I thought we'd be close to the top, but not the top. I
Yeah.
was also really surprised that I think you pointed it out in part of your paper that fields that are traditionally predominantly women also still reported high
Yeah.
incidences of sexual harassment like OBGYN and
Right.
pediatrics. Um, and then I was really surprised that urology was the lowest
Hmm.
because, I mean, I think of all the jokes that I could
Yeah.
right now with urology, but it's like, I is it just that they're more respectful of each other because of the potential for, I don't know. That was really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think the specialty breakdown has been the most cited piece of the whole report. Everyone is so curious. And I think that's because of the inherent cultural differences between specialties, right? It's like they are their own particular field. If you are an ER doc or if you are a radiologist, your worlds are completely different. The types of environments you occupy are different. How many people you're working with is different. And I'll just point folks to when we think about again the two that were at the top that were really, tied for first place, not in a good way,
Right.
but at the top of is that you think about we know that our biases are heightened when we are in stressful situations. The more that we can be calm and slow and thoughtful, we have more capacity just as human beings to mitigate our biases, to think about what we're going to say before something comes out. The second we are in time pressure, high stressful situations, especially with multiple people involved, which I think describes anesthesiology and especially emergency medicine, our biases become much more heightened because we have to rely on our emotional kind of reptilian brain reactions to things, which means if I'm stressed out and I'm late for a patient and the surgeon is yelling at me and telling me I did something wrong or that, I didn't get to this other case, um, if we're all stressed out in these situations, something might slip out, a certain word, something that's deep in the recesses of your unconscious, and this is getting into unconscious bias kind of theory, but that is something that we know is that they tend to come out more when we're in those stressful situations. And so to me, that's the number one indicator is just the kind of environment probably that folks are working in and what is kind of seen as tolerated or as okay behavior and what those specialty specific cultures might be in terms of, well, that's kind of how we do things here and that's how we get along.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't remember, and I'm sure this was in the paper, but were there regional differences? Did you look for, like, is it more prevalent on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in the South, in the Midwest?
We didn't look
Did Okay.
We didn't look by that. The only on a totally separate topic, we did look at regional differences in our salary equity report, which is completely different, but similar, are there different regions that handle equity and inclusion issues differently? And we found no difference in salary equity rates by region.
By region. Okay.
Yeah, and no difference based on institutional characteristic. If you're a huge school, if you're a small school, if you're community based, it was really all over the map. And so I would assume it would be pretty distributed, but we haven't looked at that. That's a good question.
So one of the things I really wanted to spend some time talking about is because I remember when you talked at the Women in Anesthesiology conference in San Francisco, which I attended virtually but not in person. You talked about, like, what are some things that could be done to help mitigate some of these effects. And I was going to ask, what do you think leadership can do? But then you just said that people in the administrative roles and maybe in leadership roles are often subjects for this as well. So I guess the question still is, what can leadership do? But also, I
Sure.
guess, what can we all do
Yeah.
to mitigate these effects?
Yeah, it is. everyone's job. And that's what we say generally in diversity, equity, inclusion. It would be a much easier lift and we would make much more progress if everyone could take a little step forward and make it everyone's job as opposed to, giving it to two people in the institution to push this boulder up the hill.
Right.
And so I
This is what happens, right? You're in
which is what
charge of
happens. Yeah.
Asian studies or gender equity or, diversity. It's your job to fix this
Right.
problem. And it's
Exactly.
usually, unfortunately, the woman or the underrepresented minority in medicine
Mhm.
person who gets assigned that task because, well,
Absolutely.
you're the person, you should know.
Yeah, and let's double down on their emotional labor and everything that they're
Yeah.
probably already doing, and so, yeah, it's almost like that game that we used to play as kids, light as a feather, stiff as a board, can I pick up another adult all by myself? Probably not, but if we all put, 2 fingers underneath someone, we can do that much easier. I don't know, that analogy just came to me in the moment. But I should mention that we actually outlined 10 promising practices that institutions and leaders can take in the report. But I'll, want to expand and lift up a couple of those. But those are really for you all, for readers, for institutional leaders, or anyone really who wants to take this up at their institution. We went across the 9 institutions that we interviewed and pulled out 10 common themes, not just themes, but practices that a lot of those institutions were doing, since some of these institutions are really leading in around addressing sexual harassment. So I would just point folks to the kind of second half of the report after the data are all of those promising practices that we identified. But really, the first is something that we've already kind of touched on a little bit, which I think is really making this everyone's issue. And we still think about salary equity or sexual harassment as, a woman's issue. And so we really need to shape reshape that paradigm a little bit. And so we do this with gender equity work in my office all the time broadly. Just thinking, for example, when I go out to institutions and talk to them about gender bias and gender inequities, we try to also talk about how men also suffer under these oppressive norms, and men are also subject to gender norms and stereotypes that are harmful. And I think that that diffuses some of this us versus them, and it's your problem, it's not my problem, is really helping people understand how it's all of our issue. And then in that, to make sure that we're really being intersectional. And I know that that is a new hot word that everyone has just discovered over the past couple of years. It's
Yeah.
been around since the 80s, but as long as people are talking about it, that's great. And that means that even when we're making this a women's issue, it's a white woman's issue. And we think about it purely in that way. And this really impacts all women. It impacts all genders. Again, it impacts everyone. And so thinking about then the kind of data that we're actually collecting. When we talk to different groups of folks who have multiple marginalized identities, they tell us also, you're asking your questions wrong, because I can't always tell you this is racial harassment versus sexual harassment versus homophobia. We tend to box all of these isms and look at them in silos when they're really intersecting. And so those are just kind of some contextual things. But really, what we encourage institutions to do, and we said the same thing with our salary equity work, is the first thing that leaders need to do is to actually understand what the rates are at your own institution. You can't fix what you don't understand or that you're not aware of actually happening. And we know that a lot of leaders are really reluctant to do this. They're really reluctant to actually know, so they kind of take this approach of, if and it is understandable. It's a huge undertaking. You don't know what you're going to get. And so because of that fear and reluctance, we tend to bury our heads in the sand, pretending that it's not there when in reality it's there. And so institutions that are leading in this area, and really institutions that are leading in any area of diversity, equity, inclusion, are actively surveying, they're actively seeing their bad rates, but that's much better than not knowing it all. You have to start somewhere. And so that kind of connects to that earlier point of being intersectional, is that we really need to collect much better data. and institutions, and all these questions that you're asking about the types of questions, how do we word them? This is all great information for institutions to build their own surveys. And so really doing a study, knowing what your rates look like, collecting the right information has to be the first step, because there's just way too many institutions that say we just don't want to know, when that probably means that your rates are much worse than other institutions that
Well, I
are
think there's a
surveying.
lot of institutions who also just don't think it's going on at their
Yeah,
institution. I mean,
absolutely.
if you asked me a few years ago, I would say, "Oh, no, that doesn't happen here at Stanford." But I
Right.
know it does, and I've
Yeah.
witnessed it, and yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. Is this I think I found your innovative, the 10 things. Oh, wait, maybe not. Begin
Yeah.
with zero tolerance, take a coordinated approach,
Yeah. It's a
hold
big.
chairs accountable, leverage the parent university, hire trained investigators. Oh, that's really interesting. I actually have no idea. Do places do that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So
Okay.
that was one of our interesting practices that we found, is a lot of schools, I shouldn't say a lot, a handful of schools are actually investing in trained investigators who know how to safely and appropriately not adjudicate, but to investigate claims of sexual harassment. And they say it is well worth the money of hiring one
Really?
or two people that can talk to the faculty, talk to the leaders, whoever was involved in the incident, to really investigate this and to be able to know what should happen from there. Because often, we hand these cases over to maybe our faculty affairs office, or maybe it's our student affairs office, or it's HR, when A, a lot of those folks don't have that training, and B, it may not be the appropriate person. For example, a lot of these cases go to our HR units, and we know that our human resources departments, they are fantastic and wonderful colleagues. They are there to support the institution. And so in some ways there is a conflict of interest
Oh, yeah.
when we bring these cases to HR. And so that was a really great practice that we found. And another one that I wanted to lift up is this idea, investing in training, both about what not to do, which is what I think a lot of our sexual harassment training is around, but also training around what positive behaviors look like. And I
Hmm,
don't think we do enough of
definitely.
that,
Yeah.
of really understanding where is the line, what is an appropriate joke, what is a good way to make folks feel included. And so training that is not just here's all the definitions and here's all the research and data, but and I know this makes people uncomfortable, but really doing role playing or case studies. University of Virginia has a fantastic curriculum that is all video case studies, to have people really, hit pause. What would I do in this situation? Without that kind of real world training, it's always going to be a question mark of, I don't really know what I would do in this situation. And so really and then, obviously there's a lot of other recommendations we put in there, but I would just say, along the leadership route, finally, what leaders can do, and I think this is the most important thing, is really making it safe to discuss sexual harassment, but also to report it.
Yeah.
And just from what I see and hear and everything we read about, this is the number one issue for why sexual harassment hasn't been addressed, is actually because of leaders. We haven't made it safe. We haven't made it accessible to, and we're not even talking about reporting, even just discuss it in the abstract. And so when we look and see what happens to those folks who do report, who do come out and share their experiences, they have the biggest negative impact on their career over anyone involved, not the perpetrator. And that is not right. We should not be allowing that to happen, which we know is why people don't report, as we know that it tanks your whole career because of how we're currently choosing to address this or not address this in academic medicine. And so really I think the biggest thing that leaders can do is really building and openly, transparently making it safe to talk about, but then also to report and know that that person is going to be supported. Because right now targets are all alone on an island, and they really get very little support from their institution in general. We've got some great institutions that we've highlighted in the report that are taking some innovative approaches, But yeah, just to kind of wrap that up, I would say for leaders, it really is about making it everyone's job, collecting your own good data for your institution, and then really that training and dialogue piece and the safety piece.
Great, great. I just want to just want to mention the other five things that you had listed here, just so that we get it. So, for
Yeah.
completeness sake, so you write also centralize and expand reporting, which is what you talked about. Yeah, I mean, there's no question. I think so many people, both male and female, this is, as you have said many times, this is not just a women's issue. Fear retaliation and fear
Hmm.
significant retaliation to their careers and other things if they report this. And I also think there's this real sense of disbelief when
Yeah.
you hear about X person did this to Y person. It's like, there's no way. I know that.
Yeah.
I've known that person for, so many years. This must be a mistake. And then,
Right.
sorry, I'm going to finish this. And then I just had one other comment I was going to make. Address less overt, yet still harmful behavior problems early and often. And that's what you were talking about with some of the uncomfortable, dirty
Hmm.
jokes. It's not just a dirty joke, but it's a dirty joke that's maybe demeaning or
Yeah.
demoralizing in some way. Use proportionate sanctions, communicate transparently about harassment incidents, and train beyond compliance. And I assume is that the train for positive behaviors as well as
Exactly.
because it's really hard. You're right, as a person who has to go through this training all the time to think about, oh, I shouldn't do this, but then you forget, like, but what am I supposed to do again?
Yeah, right. It is that just shift in mindset of moving away from a compliance approach, which is really the bare minimum, over to how do we really encourage and talk more about and bring into the space positive, supportive, inclusive behaviors? What does it look like? And I think that's what, not just around sexual harassment, but a lot of DEI topics, I think that's what a lot of folks are struggling with is they want to do better. They want to, treat everyone equally. And I think we have been talking about it a lot, but we haven't given folks, here's what it looks like. Here's what it definitely doesn't look like, but
Right.
here's what it looks like. This is, something to model. And so really taking that next step, I think, can be really helpful.
You talk about proportionate sanctions, which I thought was interesting because I sometimes feel that there's kind of an all or none. Like, if I
Mm,
report my colleague X who I saw sexually harassing someone. I'm too old to be sexually harassed anymore, but let's just say
not
I
true.
witness them harassing someone, or there's behavior that I find uncomfortable. It may be that I feel like, well, colleague X can be kind of an ass. I think it's okay to say that, kind of an ass sometimes, but overall, they're a really good physician. They take great care of their patients. They contribute incredibly positively to the institution and to the department, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If I report them, will they lose their job? And does that rise to the level of
Right.
something that should be a job loss? And it seems like, partly because of the Me Too movement back whenever that started, there seems to be, sometimes it's an all or none approach. You're either like, okay, you're done, you're out of here, this movie is not going to be made with you because you did this,
Right.
and it's maybe one incident, or you're no longer a member of this department. And sometimes it's like a slap on the wrist and nothing happens. So figuring out, I mean, how do you have recommendations on figuring out the proportionality of sanctions for
Yeah. And
perpetrator?
yeah, and that was a big one in particular. University of Minnesota School of Medicine had a whole process and outline and document about what their sanction levels were, and that was part of how they investigated their reports is what level does this fall under. University of New Mexico is another one that has this. That's the first step, is what level does this fall into in our model, and then we know what the process is for that. And so it makes it more approachable that it kind of diffuses some of that tension of, okay, we recognize that there are levels, so we're going to be able to talk about it. And so the way that we talked about it with these institutions it was everything from a cup of coffee with a colleague to say, hey, I know that you call me honey, you know, I'm not into that. I'm from California. It doesn't resonate with me. Everything from that to firing someone and
Right.
everything on that continuum should be the whatever the resolution is should be proportionate to what the behavior is. Nobody should get fired for calling someone honey, especially if you haven't had that conversation first, that coaching conversation. And so, and then the second part of that, so just kind of opening up that safety, but the second part of why that's so important is that it leaves it less to guesswork about what should happen when it actually happens. And I think a lot of times because institutions don't have a process, they kind of make it up on the spot, and that can make you susceptible to social pressures, other community groups that might be in your institution, if you're having other folks, which and maybe those folks should be involved in the decision making process. It's up to every institution, but it puts less guesswork when you're kind of in it in the moment, when you can be really stressed out. It really is helpful to say, we decided that this was level B. These are the sanctions that go with that.
And that again goes to your comments about transparency, that it's discussed and that people know. Like if I do, if I go up and pinch a colleague's backside, for example, and it's an unwelcome gesture, that I'm subject,
Hmm.
whether I'm male or female, I am subject to these types of sanctions,
Yeah,
versus, oh, I could get fired for doing that. Which
right.
maybe I could. I mean, I don't know. That I guess it depends on how. I don't. That's not something I do.
Yeah, I wasn't worried about that at all.
If I were to do that, I mean, I would at least, as I think, as both the perpetuator and the target have some idea of what expected
Hmm.
sanctions might be. And it also might be helpful if I'm the target of that behavior to then not have unrealistic expectations. If I feel like, well, they're calling me honey and I've asked them to stop, and
Hmm.
they slipped up and did it again because they're from the South and everybody calls everybody honey in the South. I want them, my expectation is that they should lose their job right away. And my sanction list, or what it says, that these are the recommendations, and maybe they'll have
Hmm.
some coaching or some additional
Right,
educational training, or, it's hard. I mean, lots of people in the South call people honey. And that would be a hard behavior to train out of someone.
right,
But if it's
right.
offensive, you have to do that. But, it seems like it would lead to a lot less disappointment, a lot less dissatisfaction if expectations were clear upfront.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm so glad that that's kind of where we ended at the end of this conversation, because it really is about being more transparent and having this conversation at the institution. If we continue to not talk about it and just pretend that it's not there, things will not get addressed. And so there's lots of promising examples that we have out there of different things that institutions can do, kind of depending on where you are in your sexual harassment journey. I should say anti-sexual harassment journey.
Yeah.
And so really just having institutions decide which ones make the most sense for them. But it's really about doing something. Start somewhere, do something.
Well, Diana, this has been really great and really interesting. Before we finish up, and I know we've been talking for a long time, do you have any last words of wisdom, or last pieces of advice, or anything that you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, I think I summed it up, in terms of just institutions taking any approach, but really just want to underscore again how we can, especially for women or people who are leading women's groups or diversity, equity, inclusion groups, really to encourage us to include more folks in this conversation. The more we can get men into this conversation and people with dominant identities, that's really going to help us go much further and really make much more progress. So we really need to make sure that we're including all voices in the conversation and engaging those people who maybe have felt like this doesn't apply to them or it's not their issue or topic. Let's lean into that, and really ask them what they feel and make them part of the conversation. And that's how I think we're going to make the most progress.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been really fun and really interesting for me, and I hope for our listeners as well. And thank you so much for taking time out of, I know, your very busy schedule this close to the holidays to do this with us. This concludes another episode of Vital Times, the podcast, and I hope you'll join us for the next one.